What complicated problem was solved by an amazingly simple solution? Shipping containers. Before the 1950s, shipping goods across the ocean was expensive and chaotic. Every piece of cargo had to be loaded and unloaded manually from trucks, to trains, to ships, which was incredibly time-consuming, and also resulted in a lot of theft, damage, or your goods ending up mixed in with someone else's goods. Malcolm McLean invented a simple steel box that stacks and transfers easily between ships, trucks, and trains. It cut loading time from days to hours, and cut costs by 90%, and quickly became the standard for global trade. The British military couldn't get their soldiers to take their doses of anti-malarial. At the time, it was quinine mixed with water, and called tonic water. Quinine tastes incredibly bitter. So the soldiers kept getting sick or dying from malaria because they would not drink their daily tonic water. The simple solution was to give the soldiers a ration of gin, which alters the flavor of the quinine. And thus, the gin and tonic cocktail was born. Airports were frequently dealing with pissed-off passengers who were able to get off the plane fairly quickly, but I hated the long wait for their bags. They tried to hire more staff to speed it up, they tried to move the belts faster. But people were still angry and annoyed at the time spent standing around waiting for their bags to be unloaded. The simple fix? Just move the baggage claim further from the arrival gate, so that passengers spent more time walking. By the time they got to their bags, they were often waiting, and the number of complaints plummeted. The Japanese, pointing and calling. Safety standard, Shisakanko, Juchanhu, in the railway industry. By physically pointing at and saying what you're about to do, human error was reduced by almost 85%. It engages more areas of your brain, seeing, speaking, hearing, motion, which act like fail-safes. I've implemented similar habits in real life. I always touch my key/wallet/phone before leaving the house. Keep my eyes on what I'm working on. I do an okay hand gesture after locking the door, so I don't forget, etc. The game series Wing Commander used more memory than the base memory limit of the pre-Windows Microsoft DOS operating system, which means it requires expanded memory management, which is more complex. During development of the first game in the series, there was a defect that after a user exited the game, the expanded memory manager would output a specific error message to the command interface, which looks bad, but is a non-issue because the game is exited. To buy themselves some time to fix the issue while still being able to demo the game to stakeholders, one of the developers edited the expanded memory manager itself to change that one specific error message to "Thank you for playing Wing Commander." Women and their newborns dying from infection after childbirth. Solution: doctors washing hands before and after meeting a patient. Forgot the name of the doctor that thought of it, but I remember he was striped of all his titles and sent to an asylum for trying to push doctors to implement this into their practice. Oh, I have a good one. So, with lung transplants, an issue has always been, how long can the lungs be out of the donor and still be viable traditionally? You store them on ice around 4 degrees Celsius, and 5 to 6 hours is kind of typical for the ischemic time. Longer you start to have issues. This creates many logistical issues. Now there's more and more devices out now that can extend that, keep it warm, pump blood through it, oxygenate it, etc., but those are all complex and hella expensive. Turns out, if you just store the lungs in a fridge at 10 degrees Celsius, the ischemic time can be increased to 12 hours or even more without worse outcomes versus traditional cold storage. Aircraft checklists. Before a 1935 crash of a B-17 prototype, pilots just trained on how to do the necessary steps of starting, taking off, cruising, etc., etc. A very experienced test pilot forgot to take off the gust locks before takeoff, a control restrictor, so that things don't move around in the wind while sitting on the ground. After the crash, engineers developed the first checklist for each stage of flight, so that each little/big item would be sure to be attended to, and so you didn't have to depend on your memory. I don't know if that happened everywhere, but in France, iodine deficiency was a major public health problem in the mountains, and in places far away from the sea because before refrigerated transport, they couldn't have access to seafood. They simply added a little bit of iodine to table salt, and it erased the problem overnight. Clean water. A whole bunch of complicated public health issues were solved/reduced by controlling city water supplies and making them clean. Clean water laws had a more immediate impact on longevity than vaccines and antibiotics. For vaccines and antibiotics, it takes a generation for the increased lifespan to start showing up in your statistics. The evidence that sanitary water saved lives was clear within a couple of years. Source: Gerald Grob, The Deadly Truth, A History of Disease in America. I'm reminded of the anecdote that American astronauts spent all this time and money developing a pen that could operate in zero gravity, when the Russians just simply used pencils. But the truth to that story has been stretched for the joke. In reality, the tiny shards of graphite that could break off from a pencil could go flying through the cabin and eventually find its way into electronics that could short-circuit, which could be a huge problem. Not to mention accidentally inhaling them, or shards ending up in your eyes. So the Fisher Space pen uses pressurized nitrogen cartridges to force the ink down, instead of relying on gravity. Ink stays on paper, no more risk of conductive shards of graphite flying all over the place. Barbed wire was revolutionary for farming. It was cheap and allowed for the erection of large-scale fencing for the first time, ultimately leading to the industrialization of agriculture. Many deadly infections were cured after the discovery of a forgotten moldy petri dish. Penicillin and antibiotics rule. Copying poorly redacted documents into a text editor and removing the formatting. Smallpox was very deadly. Estimates put the mortality rate for outbreaks somewhere between 20–30%, but with some outbreaks as high as 35%. A few different solutions were tried. In China, powdered scabs could be used to induce a mild case, and then immunity, but with a 2–3% mortality rate. Despite the risk, this was considered worthwhile enough the knowledge spread to Europe and Africa. Edward Jenner developed a better solution using the pus from cowpox infections to inoculate people against smallpox.